But you have to ask yourself, is this idea, which has been largely touted now as the potential plan B for the SNP to hold a de facto referendum, these are their words, de facto referendum, this is something which doesn't actually exist, but to hold a de facto referendum within a British general election as a way of measuring the number of votes cast in favour of independence is fraught with problems. We all know what the problems are. The primary ones are the fact that it's a confusing system, because the British electoral system is first past the post. It's not the party with the greatest number of votes which wins a general election in the UK. It's the party which wins more seats than any other, not necessarily because they have more votes. But on the other hand, if the Scottish Government were to go ahead with this plan to make the next general election in the UK a de facto independence referendum, then we would need to see at least 51% of all of the votes going to the SNP. Now that would mean a complete wipeout of virtually every MP from a unionist party in Scotland, but critically, it would exclude all the 16 and 17-year-olds who are currently allowed to vote in Scotland under our own legislation, and it would exclude all EU nationals who've settled in Scotland. They would not be allowed to vote in a UK general election. And that could take out as much as 400,000 or 500,000 voters from the Scottish electoral roll, because the Scottish electoral roll for the referendum was approximately 4 million people, roughly. It was about 3.98 million people who voted in the independence referendum in 2014. And we know that the winning margin was actually a vote number of approximately 2.2 million Scots who allegedly voted against independence. Now, if we were to go down the road of doing this de facto referendum within the British electoral system, they could just simply say, it doesn't work that way, this is an election, can't use it as a referendum, and nobody's going to respect it. However, on the other hand, there is always the Scottish Parliament. Now, if the Scottish Parliament was to dissolve or be dissolved by, say, the mass resignation of, say, all of the SNP and all of the Greens and any ALBA MSPs, I'm not sure if there are any, but if all the pro-independence parties' representation resigned at once, it would force a snap general election. And in that snap general election, under our own legislation, 16 and 17-year-olds and EU nationals would be able to vote. And it wouldn't matter too much how many seats were won, because the votes are counted, and they're counted with the idea of sharing out I think it's something like just under 40% of the seats are allocated based on vote share for those who didn't win seats in the first past the post part of the election. However, let's say that this happened. We could virtually guarantee that at least 2.2 million people would vote for the SNP, would vote yes to independence, but it would depend on the manifesto being a single policy only. And that policy would be perhaps not just a policy or even a pledge, but a written contract, a legal document written and signed by all members of the SNP, the Greens, and anyone else who's a pro-independence party and running for election, so that there is not just a mandate and not just a promise to effect independence, but an actual legal commitment by the government based on their signature on a document which would make a contract with the people of Scotland to actually negotiate independence in the event of a majority of votes for those parties. It's not rocket science. This can be done. The question really is this so-called de facto referendum that the SNP has talked about simply a red herring? I mean, it could be done, but would the British government respect it? Well, of course they wouldn't. They don't even respect the 2014 referendum properly, and they're claiming that it was once in a generation, even though nobody has ever written that into the Scotland Act or the Edinburgh Agreement. No such wording was ever used, and yet we're now being asked to believe that once in a generation, and nobody can define a generation. Truss is known to be opposed to a legal referendum as well as an illegal one. So if Scotland is told by the Supreme Court in its rulings in the next week or so that we cannot hold a lawful referendum in Holyrood, then the only other option really, which is realistic, would be to have a snap general election in Holyrood. And that would be far more difficult for the United Kingdom to counter. For one thing, it wouldn't take so long. The British state would be surprised by that because they'd be expecting us to wait till 2024 to have a general election which they could then deny us independence from. In this way, they can't really interfere. And a complete wipeout in terms of votes is almost guaranteed given the absolute chaos which is surrounding the whole United Kingdom at the moment. There are one or two key things which would need to be done, and I think the legalities of this could be legislated for if the Scottish Government is smart enough to do it, and if the other parties of independence are prepared to go along with it. I can't see any reason why this can't be done, because a single issue general election is a perfectly lawful thing. The Scottish Parliament has the right to hold general elections. What the subject matter is of the party manifestos is wide open and completely unlimited, as long as I guess you weren't planning to declare war on somebody. So I don't see an issue with this, and I think this is the way to go, because I know that we can guarantee that virtually all of the EU nationals will vote Scotland out of the UK and back into the EU, and we also know that about 75% of all of those aged 60 and up are pro-independence. They have never known anything other than the European Union, and to find out that they have been dragged out of it like this is deeply upsetting and worrying for many young people who are now struggling to find a job, and knowing that they can no longer rely on going to Europe to find work, particularly for university graduates, and not being able to study there or live there, not to mention the fact that we can't export properly to there. These all put pressures on people to go towards independence, not away from it. Independence is now the safe option, and that is really what we need to advertise it as. And we need to keep pointing out the negativity of remaining in the Union. Never mind having the whole campaign being very positive and jolly and everybody clapping and singing. We need to really rubbish the United Kingdom. Although despite the fact that it's doing a pretty good job of that by itself, we need to emphasise the multiple failures of the Tory party and the dire consequences for the future of these islands if Scotland remains in the Union. And it's interesting that the recent Welsh March for Independence actually had a higher number of marchers than we did here in Scotland. That interests me greatly, because if the Welsh people are finally waking up to the idea that staying in the Union is not a good idea, and in Northern Ireland we now have a majority of Catholic residents in Northern Ireland, then the tables are beginning to turn, and the whole balancing point of the British seesaw, this balancing act of spinning all the plates and keeping everybody in confusion, is no longer going to work. So now is really the time to think about a plan C. In fact, it should really have been the plan B, and I think that the plan B idea of a de facto referendum may well come to nothing, because I can't see any realistic way that we could gain anything out of it, even if we won it decisively and won all the seats, and even if we did get 51% of the votes, it still wouldn't be accepted by the UK. We need to do this under our own legislation, in our own way, without the interference of people like Liz Truss making decisions for us and telling us what we can and cannot do. We know that we can have a general election in Scotland, so long as the politicians decide that they are going to all resign en masse and dissolve Parliament and force a general election. I'm pretty sure that this can be done. Maybe those of you out there who know more about the parliamentary system in Holyrood than I do will know whether this is possible or not, but to me, that's a no-brainer. Why throw away over 500,000 votes and go for a general election 2 years from now, which you may or may not win, and which will probably not result in independence anyway, when you have a surefire method here of doing it without the interference of the very people who are trying to stop you? Anyway, that's my thoughts for today. But remember, the Tories are the kings and queens of chaos at the moment. They're crashing the economy. They don't know what to do. Nobody knows who to support. The Tories are at each other's throats. The Labour Party is 30 points ahead in the polls without actually doing anything because the Tories are so bad. This is a terrible situation where you're asked to vote not for a good party, but for the party that's not as bad as the Tories. We have the opportunity, uniquely in these islands, to escape, and escape whenever we want. All we need is our politicians to make that courageous step, to basically give up their careers or put them on hold temporarily, to make sure that we have this vote, and have this vote in a general election in Scotland. And I can guarantee you that probably all of the current MSPs, pro-independence MSPs, even if they did risk their own salaries and their own careers in the process of trying to do this, I can virtually guarantee you that every single one of them will get re-elected, and a lot more besides. Anyway, those are my thoughts today. Let me know what you think of this idea, but to my mind, an independence referendum within a UK general election is still a really stupid idea. It's too risky, it's far less likely to succeed. We can't control the outcome, and there's no guarantee that even if we're successful, any of it would be accepted or respected by anybody. A Scottish election is a much better way to do this because it involves only us, and it's only us that can make this decision. I'll see you soon. Bye bye for now.